view of underlying data sources accessed through entity bean in Jakarta enterprise bean or EJB. Here you can see a view of underlying data sources accessed through entity beans. The enterprise beans component model provides a separation between client view of a bean as presented by its home and component interfaces and the entity bean class, which provides implementation of the client view. The enterprise beans architecture for container managed persistent adds to this separation between entity bean class as defined by the bean provider and its persistent representation. The container managed persistent architecture thus provides not only a layer of data independence between client view of beans and as an entity bean and the bean provider internal view of the bean in terms of an entity bean instance, but also between the entity bean instance and its persistence representation. This allows an entity bean to be evolved independently from its client without requiring the redefinition or recompilation of these clients, and it allows an entity bean to be redeployed across different containers and different persistent data stores without requiring the redefinition or recompilation of entity bean class. In a container managed persistent, unlike in bean managed persistence, the bean provider does not write database access calls in the methods of the entity bean class. Instead, persistence is handled by the container at runtime. The entity bean provider must specify in the deployment descriptor those persistent field and relationship for which the container must handle data access. The bean provider codes all persistent data access by using the accessor methods that are defined for the abstract persistence schema. The implementation of the persistent field and relationships as well as all data access is deferred to the container. It is the responsibility of the deployer to map the abstract persistent schema of a set of interrelated entity bean classes into physical schema used by the underlying data store. For example, into a relational schema by using the containers providers tools. The deployer uses the deployment descriptor as the input to the container providers tools to perform this mapping. The container providers tools are also used to generate the concrete implementation of the entity bean classes, including the code that delegate calls to the accessor methods of the entity bean class to the runtime persistent data access layer of the container. The enterprise beans deployment descriptor for entity bean 2.1. Entity beans describe logical relationships among entity beans. It does not provide a mechanism for specifying how the abstract persistent schema of an entity bean or of a set of interrelated entity beans is to be mapped to underlying database. This is the responsibility of the deployer, who using the container provider tools uses logical relationships that are specified in the deployment descriptor to map the physical relationships that are specific to underlying resource. It is the responsibility of the container to manage the mapping between the logical and physical relationships at runtime and to manage the referential integrity of the relationships. The advantage of using container managed persistent is that the entity bean can be logically independent of the data source in which the entity is stored. The container providers tools can, for example, generate classes that use JDBC or SQLJ to access entity state in a relational database, classes that implement access to non-relational data source such as an IMS database, or classes that implement function calls to existing enterprise applications. These tools are typically specific to data source. Here you can see entity bean is an object view of the collection of related records in the database. Here the entity bean is an object view of the existing application. Here you can see client is connected to order entity bean, which is in the container. Order entity bean is connected to here order 100 here. Connected to the database. Order 100 is in the database here. Client is connected to order entity bean. Order entity bean is in the container here. Order entity bean is connected to existing application. Existing application is connected to data source here, and order 100 is inside the database here. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.